Good afternoon, and welcome to the CEC webinar, CEC Standards Development, Setting the Foundation for the Future of Special Education. My name is Lori Vanderploeg, and I'm pleased to have all of you join us for this important webinar. As the President of the Council for Exceptional Children, I help to make sure that CEC is meeting our strategic plan goals, one of which is to ensure that educators will be highly competent professionals entrusted to provide quality instruction that will enable all students to pursue their full potential. From its earliest days, CEC has recognized the crucial role of professional standards in ensuring all educators are prepared to support every student. CEC standards are used to assess and review over 200 teacher preparation programs every year. In addition to serving as the foundation for a variety of purposes, including curriculum development, state licensing, and for defining staff roles at the district and school levels. As a specialized professional association in partnership with the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, or CAEP, CEC must review and revise our standards every 7 years to ensure the standards are reflective of current trends, research and evidence-based practices in the field of special education. To lead this critically important work, CEC has established the Standards Development Workgroup of 13 selected volunteers from various specialty areas within our field. This group has built on the foundational work done by 2 prior CEC work groups, tasked with the important work of ensuring the CEC Professional Practice Standards are rigorous, evidence-based, reflective of essential practices special educators must utilize to support their students, and that they are aligned with CAEP guidelines for strong professional standards. Here today to talk about the standards development process and unveil the first draft of the future CEC Professional Preparation Standards are the co-chairs of the Standards Development Workgroup, Dee Burlinghoff and Virginia McLaughlin. I'll turn it over to them now.
Thank you, Lori. This is Jenny McLaughlin, and Dee and I want to extend our words of welcome to those that Lori and Megan have already presented. We've been looking forward to this opportunity to share the work of our Standards Development Workgroup with you this afternoon. Lori was just explaining how the standards revision process has been on a recurring 7-year cycle. But I want to assure you that this has not been just a rote process. Our current standards development effort has really been years in the making. CEC approached this round really carefully and intentionally, considering some of the more important influences in the professional landscape, probably most notably the recent emphases on practice and performance-based assessments, together with the specific expectations of CAEP, our newly created accrediting body. The Professional Standards Workgroup in 2013 set the stage for a framing paper work group in 2016 and 2017 that made very specific recommendations about both the focus of the standards and the process for development of next generation standards. In effect, the standards framing paper provided a blueprint for the current revision effort. You'll see their recommendations reflected in the content of upcoming slides on what standards should involve. So the work of these prior groups truly set the stage for our work today. We'll now look at the timeline for creation and review and approval of our CEC standards. At the TED conference in November 2017, we held our first open forum to elicit feedback from members in terms of what was going well with the current set of standards and what we ought to look at improving in this next round. The work group convened for its first face-to-face meeting in December of 2018, We had had several webinars and online meetings prior to that, but this gave us an opportunity to really process the input that we had received from members at TED. We also held a feedback session at the 2018 CEC Convention in February. The first draft of our standards were developed this past April, and we're now opening them this summer for public comment. And you are our first group to really have a chance to preview these proposed standards. We'll convene in July this summer to consider the extensive feedback that we'll receive from our members and to use that information to refine and improve the draft standards. We're also working this summer to develop the supporting materials required by CAEP. This includes some unpacking and explanations of what the standards involve, as well as research bases and rubrics. There will be additional feedback opportunities in the fall at the TED conference and in other venues, at the CEC conference this winter, and that information will also be incorporated into further revisions. We have to present our draft standards to the PSPC in spring 2019, and the new application submission deadline is July 1st, 2020, when CEC will present its proposal to CAEP. Assuming that we get CAEP approval, the new CEC initial standards will be available for use in program review in 2020. They're optional in 2020, but will be mandatory for program review and approval in 2022.
So when we talk about the standards, we need to keep a few things in mind. Lori did address some of these, but this is just a reminder as we move forward and just think about what framed the conversation in developing the draft standards. We know that the standards need to be developed from the foundational recommendations of the 2017 framing paper, and all members of the work group received the framing paper, and we all use that to guide our work. We know that we need to base the standards on current research and trends in the field. We need to describe and make use of the knowledge base, and we need to be thoughtful about including current empirical research, wisdom of practice, and what is appropriate for professionals in the field. Part of what we also need to do in this with the standards is describe what proficient candidates need to know and be able to do as they complete their program. So we're really talking about candidates as they are completing their program as opposed to practicing teachers. And we have a good focus and good reference to the high leverage practices and the DEC recommended practices. We are making good efforts for the standards to avoid proscribing preparation practice or curriculum. We do want programs to be able to make decisions based on locally what's happening and not have to make hard and fast rules based on standards decisions. We also know that CEC is a global organization, and therefore we cannot include specific strategies or practices. For example, IEP is a term that is used in the United States, but it may not be used internationally. So you will likely not see the specific term IEP in the standards because we need the standards to reflect global practices, not specific geographical practices. And we do want our standards to focus on students and creation of environments that foster student learning. In thinking about standards development, we also have to keep in mind the adherence to the CAEP guidelines, because CEC will submit our proposed standards to CAEP. We do have to adhere to what CAEP says we need to do. So just to keep those guidelines in mind, we know we have a maximum of 7 standards. So we can have 7, we can have 5, but we can have more than 7. Within those 7 standards, we are eligible to include a maximum of 28 elements that are measurable and accessible. So if we have 7 standards, we could have 4 elements under each. We could have some, and you'll see as we move into the specific standards, some may have as few as 3 and others may have 5, but we are limited to a maximum of 28. We need to be able to assess those elements and the standards through a limited number of assessments. And we need to write the standards around the 4 guiding in-task principles. Principle A, which is the learner and learning. Principle B, which is content. Principle C, which is instructional practice. Principle D, professional responsibility. And we are responsible to make sure that we have CAEP's cross-cutting theme on technology and digital learning, and that those themes need to be shown across the standards.
And there are a few more things to keep in mind. These initial draft standards need to be focused on performance. These will be practice-based standards, and this was one of the very strong recommendations of the Standards Framing Workgroup. The other thing in this first bullet point that's really important is that we need to keep the focus on the essential practices of beginning special educators. As Dee was saying, we're allowed only 7 standards and 28 elements. And as special educators, as professionals, there are so many things that we want good teachers to know and be able to do. But it's really important that we focus on what's essential, what are the essential practices for beginning special education teachers. We've been working within CEC and CAEP parameters, following their guidelines for submission of our proposal. And they require quite a bit of information beyond the standards themselves, yet it has to be very clear and concise, a complete document that we'll submit. Please be generous in your reviews and recognize that drafts are just that. They are drafts. And what we're sharing with you today is our first round that's ready for prime time. It has been worked over extensively by our work group and trying to address all of the considerations that Dee just reiterated, as well as the feedback that we received from the forums thus far. But we assure you that as we get your feedback and the continuing rounds of feedback, we will continue to make refinements to our work. And as the drafts become more complete with the supporting documentation, we'll also be circulating those for review as well. We thought this next slide might be helpful in presenting a side-by-side comparison of the current 2012 initial preparation standards, the 7 standards that you see to the left of the slide, next to the new draft initial standards, the 7 standards listed on the right. Hopefully this will help you recognize some continuity that we really have tried to build very deliberately upon the 2012 standards, while also making some modifications along the way. And I'll just mention a couple of things that you may notice right away. First of all, we reframed the 2012 Standard 6 as the very first standard, engaging in professional learning and practice within ethical guidelines, because our group believed that this provided the overarching lens for all that follows, that we didn't want to make ethical and legal practice an afterthought, but we really needed to put it right out there up front. You'll also see that we've expanded the 2012 Standard 2 on the learning environment into a new number 6, supporting social, emotional, and behavioral growth. These are just a couple of the differences that you'll see in the proposed draft standards, while hopefully you'll also recognize a lot of continuity. We definitely tried to build upon the 2012 set while taking into consideration the new developments, research, trends in the field, and the feedback in terms of what's been working and what could be improved.
So before we get into really talking about the standards, I'll just give a little bit of an overview. We will introduce the standards. We will not read them verbatim. We'll review just the standard itself. So you'll notice the standard itself will be at the top part of the page, and then the components are indicated below and numbered. The components have the critical aspects indicated in bold. So what we will talk about when we get to each of the individual draft standards is just a review of the standard language itself, and then you can take a look at the individual components and the parts that are bolded, which are reflective of the standards language itself, because all of the standards, all of the components reflect what's in the standards. So that being said, our draft standard 1, engaging in professional learning and practice within ethical guidelines, the first thing you might notice, and you may notice the shift in the language, is that each standard now starts with an ing form of the word, so that we can really start talking about active performance-based behaviors that we can measure. So in looking at Standard 1, engaging in professional learning, candidates practice within ethical and legal guidelines, engage in ongoing self-reflection to design and implement professional learning activities, and advocate for improved outcomes for individuals with exceptionalities and their families, while considering their social, cultural, and linguistic diversity. I think it's important to note before we go on to Standard 2, we tried to, through all of the standards, to have the cross-cutting themes of families and making sure that we were talking about all areas of diversity without having extensive lists. That information will come after we have compiled some of the feedback and we are able to provide some of the supporting documentation that will come in the next month or two.
So as Dee emphasized, we're just highlighting the content of each of these draft standards. So please don't worry about reading every word of the standards and the components right now. As Megan was explaining, you'll receive information within the next week on accessing the full draft of the standards and all of the components, and you'll have a chance to review these in depth at your leisure. Standard 2 focuses on understanding and addressing each individual's developmental and learning needs. You'll see that the three components, and particularly the concepts that are bolded, are encompassed in the standard itself, in that candidates will use their understanding of human growth and development, the multiple influences on development, individual differences and diversity, to plan and implement inclusive learning environments and experiences that provide individuals with exceptionalities, high-quality learning experiences reflective of each individual's strengths and needs. Again, each of the three components that follows unpacks those basic constructs with a focus on a major dimension of it.
So standard 3, demonstrating curricular and content knowledge. I think it's important to comment that the standards work group felt it was really important to have a standalone standard for curricular and content knowledge, because our candidates are responsible for all levels of curricular content, that we would be remiss if we did not have a standalone or separate curricular and content knowledge standard. So we did include that in the final, in the draft document, because we felt it was so important for our teacher candidates. And if you look at the two elements, the rigorous content standards and modifying general and specialized curricula, those are included in the standard statement. Candidates use their knowledge of general and specialized curricula to individualize learning for individuals with exceptionalities to plan, teach, accommodate, assess, and modify curricula based on the individual learner needs across all settings.
So D emphasized the importance of curricular and content knowledge for our special educators. And we should also note that this is one of the principles that CAEP requires to be included in all of the SPA standards. So the fourth proposed standard focuses on assessment, using assessment to understand the learner and the learning environment for database decision making. You'll see three subcomponents here. The first focusing on using assessment for eligibility determinations. The second focused on short and long-term instructional planning and progress monitoring. And the third focused on evaluation and support of school-wide systems for instruction and intervention. So all of those constructs should be reflected in the overall standards, that candidates evaluate students to determine eligibility, communicate students' progress, inform short and long-term instructional planning, and make ongoing adjustments to instruction using technology as appropriate. Candidates evaluate students' learning, behavior, and classroom environment to support students in school-based problem-solving, systems of intervention, and instruction. You'll also see some references to assessment showing up in the next standard dealing with effective instruction. And we had some really useful discussion about where the assessment competencies, the assessment practices belonged. So we really hope that by having the separate standard as well as having it infused into the effective instruction, that we'll really emphasize the importance of database decision making.
And to follow up on that, as we lead into Standard 5, supporting learning using effective instruction, we wanted people to see that assessment really does go across standards, and it's difficult to house it in just one place. This is also, the instruction standard is very meaty. It contains a lot of really heavy-duty content and ideas. And if you are at all familiar with the HLPs and the HLP documents, you will notice a lot of parallel language, and the HLPs are very strongly represented in this standard. And that group was very very diligent about remaining true to the HLPs. So again, we're talking about supporting learning using effective instruction, and we are looking at candidates use knowledge of the individual's development, learning needs, and assessment to inform decisions about effective instruction. Candidates use explicit instructional strategies, employ strategies to promote active engagement and increased motivation to differentiate instruction and support each individual, and use flexible grouping, small group instruction, and individual instruction. Candidates teach individuals to use metacognitive strategies to support and self-regulate learning. That's a mouthful, but I think when you take time and start to look at the subcomponents, it really does start to break it down into understandable and usable, accessible parts, multiple assessments, strategies for student engagement, explicit systematic instruction, and this needs to go to the next slide. Multiple effective instructional practices. We really felt like flexible grouping was important, focused intensive small group instruction, and specialized individual instruction. So as I mentioned earlier, we are permitted to have 7 standards with 28 subcomponents. You can see from this, and I'm going to flip back, you can see standard 5 was very heavy on the subcomponents because we felt like instruction was really critical to what candidates, beginning teachers, need to be able to do as part of their practice.
So this is Standard 6 that I alluded to earlier, which is really an expanded version of the 2012 Standard 2 on learning environments, because we wanted to go into more depth on supporting social, emotional, and behavioral growth, knowing that this is a major area of responsibility for special educators. So we have 3 subcomponents here. The first focus is on the creation of safe, caring, respectful, productive learning environments. The second really refers to the use of a range of preventive and responsive practices to support individual well-being. And the third on the systematic use of data to plan, implement, and evaluate behavioral interventions and social skills programs. Number 3 is a good example of a point that Dee had made earlier about our not using terminology or referring to practices that are unique to the United States or apply only to certain states and school districts. We're talking about using data to identify the functions served by behavior, to plan, implement, and evaluate interventions. But you'll notice that we're not using jargon like functional behavior analysis or behavior improvement plans, but really describing the effective practices that are required to perform those functions. So standard number 6 is that effective candidates create and contribute to safe, respectful, and productive learning environments for individuals with exceptionalities through the use of effective routines and procedures, and use a range of preventive and responsive practices to support social, emotional, and educational well-being. They follow ethical and legal guidelines and work collaboratively with families and other professionals to conduct behavioral assessments for intervention and program development. That last sentence referring to ethical and legal guidelines and collaboration is intentionally redundant with the other standards. Standard 1 that deals with ethical and legal, and Standard 7 that deals with collaboration, because the group felt that this was particularly critical when dealing with social, emotional, and behavioral issues. So we left that in intentionally to emphasize that.
And the other piece for Standard 6, the group felt was important when we get to the supporting documentation, and writing the supporting documentation and resources for Standard 6. This is where we will bring in the work of the maltreatment work group, and that group has a lot of really good resources, and we felt that was the place for all of those resources and that great work to be highlighted so that we could make use of that in our teacher preparation programs.
Yeah, thanks, Dee. That was an important point.
And then our final standard is Standard 7, collaborating with families, paraprofessionals, and other professionals. And before I get into the specific language, we felt like it was important to delineate each of those groups of people, families, paraprofessionals, and other professionals, so that we are clear that collaboration with all constituent groups is important, so that our candidates are seeing that collaboration matters, whether it's with families or paraprofessionals or other professionals. So one of the areas we felt was important was group facilitation and leading meetings, and just collaborating and communicating. And then finally, in just collaborating and communicating within the community. And we came to a draft standard that stated candidates apply team processes and communication strategies to collaborate in a culturally responsive manner with families, paraprofessionals, and other professionals within the school, other educational settings, and the community to plan programs and access services for individuals with exceptionalities and their families.
So we have just reviewed the 7 draft standards and know that that's a tremendous amount of information to process so quickly. So we wanted to reiterate what the next steps are and the opportunities for you to glean more information. As Megan noted at the beginning, there will be a survey available sent to you via an email link that will be sent to all webinar attendees. It will be publicized to CEC members and the public in June, just next week. There will be additional in-person forum for feedback opportunities at the TED conference in Las Vegas in November and at the CEC annual convention in Indianapolis in January and early February 2019. So please, we urge you to respond to the survey and to participate in these forums, and also to please share this with your colleagues who are CEC members or members of relevant stakeholder groups. We noted earlier that we have a lot more work to do beyond the standards, and as we start to close in on our final draft of the standards themselves, we'll be simultaneously working on the explanations, the research, literature review, and the rubrics, other materials as well, and those will be sent out for review as well. So here we have the website where you can find lots of information about this standards development effort. So you will find there, for example, a list of the workgroup members, the colleagues that are working really diligently on this. It's been a terrific group who bring tremendous experience and expertise and also have really given 100% to this effort. But you'll find the full draft of standards and the components. You can refer to the framing paper document from 2017, and you'll get specific information about the public feedback opportunities at TED, at the CEC Convention, and online.
And if I could add to that, add to what Ginny said, if you will be in Las Vegas for TED, we are hoping to have 2 separate feedback sessions. It will be the same session, but on different days at different times, so that if you can't come to the first one, you would have an opportunity to attend the second one, so that you're not just limited to that one in-person opportunity. And of course, the survey opportunities are available, and the website. And Jenny and I have both, as have Megan and Jennifer, answered emails. So if you do have questions, please feel free to email us. We have tried to answer questions to the best of our ability, given the information we had at the time of the question.
Okay, this is Megan with CEC. I'll give you guys just a minute to process some of the stuff that we talked about today. As Dee and Ginny said, we know it's a lot. As a reminder, you will get information that will have a link to the full list of standards and components. So they're all together and you won't have to flip between PowerPoint slides. So be on the lookout for that sometime in the next week. That email that you get will also include, as we mentioned, a link to a public comment feedback survey where you can share your feedback on these drafts with us. You'll receive information on more of the standards development process, as we mentioned, the other in-person opportunities as those become fully scheduled. You can access a lot of the documents that we referenced today, the framing paper that recommended the development of this work group. You can access the high leverage practices and the DEC recommended practices on the HLP's website. All kinds of good stuff. We know this is a lot for you guys right now and you probably need a minute or two, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to share those in the chat box with us. All right, it doesn't look like we have any questions at the moment. And you'll see on the side in your chat box the link to the standards development page, which you'll see on the PowerPoint because you can't click that one right now. You'll see that link in your chat box. That's also a link that will come through in the follow-up information you'll receive. So as I mentioned, that email with all kinds of good stuff in it will be coming out in the next week or so. It'll also be on the CEC website at that link that was just posted. Please feel free, as Ginny said, to share that with your colleagues, folks who are involved in special education or related fields. We want feedback from all of you guys because you're so intimately involved in this, and we need your expertise to really make sure that we are preparing all of our teacher candidates for exactly what they need to be able to do. So there's a follow-up question. Barbara wants to know if there will be reviews of the specialty sets. Dee or Ginny, would either of you like to address that?
Okay, this is Dee. And Ginny, please correct me if I'm wrong. As I understand it, our task is the initial standards and then the advanced. And in previous meetings, the specialty sets will be left to the divisions, and divisions were advised to hold off on revisions until the initial standards were revised.
Yes, that's correct. One of the strong recommendations from the Standards Framing Workgroup is that the initial preparation standards, the initial practice-based standards, would be the sole basis for accreditation of programs. And this has always been the case, but it was important to reiterate this because the specialty sets were to inform review and certainly to inform curriculum and course development. But there had always been a little bit of confusion in the field as to how they were really taken into account in the accreditation process. So the emphasis was on development and use of these initial practice-based standards as the sole basis for accreditation. And then, as Dee said, looking at the interest and need for the specialty sets and allowing divisions to make the determination as to how they wanted to move forward with updating the knowledge and skills statements.
Thank you, guys. And we just got another question from Brenda. Will we have international participation in the review of the standards?
Well, Megan and Jen, you might be able to help us with this, but since CEC is an international organization, these requests for feedback will include any of our international members, and their input and feedback would be welcome. Will there be other more targeted opportunities to elicit international feedback?
Yeah, this is Jennifer Bullock. Hi, everyone. So Jenny's absolutely right. The standards feedback survey link will be available on the CEC website on the home page and the standards page for any CEC member or member of the public to contribute feedback at this point. Also, as mentioned earlier, there will be opportunities at the CEC and TED Convention for those that are in attendance, and we anticipate additional online feedback opportunities as these standards drafts move forward in the future as we get closer to our finalization of them and before submission to CAEP. So there will be multiple opportunities for anyone with interest to submit feedback to the group.
Okay, and I had another question come through about the current standards, not this draft that's currently being worked on, but the current CEC standards, which were last revised in 2012. Those are available on the CEC website at cec.sped.org/standards. That'll also, you'll be able to find it once you get the link for all this follow-up in your email soon. They're also available in what we like to call the Red Book, which is what every special educator must know. Like I said, the digital copies are available online, and you can also purchase a hard copy if you're one of those people like me who likes to actually flip through things and highlight them. So that information can be found on the CEC website. All right, it doesn't look like we have any other questions at the moment. That there's one or two I'll address offline. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to thank Dee and Ginny for taking charge on this work group and for taking charge on this webinar and for their time and expertise, and to all of you for your time and expertise and your commitment to this standards work and our field of special education.